Hey, Farmers Branch family. We're back to our study of the amazing prophecy of Daniel. Now, as you recall, last week we had the story of Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the statue. And we talked about its interpretation. We talked about the nature of these first few chapters of Daniel and how that they are sort of a court account, almost matter of fact description of the events surrounding the lives of Daniel and his three Hebrew friends. And we went through that story last week, and there was one point that I had wanted to make, and in reviewing the lesson from last week had not done it. And I was reminded of it listening while traveling this last week, to a sermon by Alistair Begg. If you've never heard Alistair Begg preach, it's Alistair, B-E-G, Begg. You can find him on YouTube. An amazing preacher. One of my favorites to listen to. He's from Scotland. He pastors in the United States, and he has some amazing messages. And he reminded me of the point. And so I'd like to go back and do a little housekeeping on that before we move on to the third chapter. You recall when Nebuchadnezzar summoned Daniel at Daniel's request, to be heard before the king, so that he might tell him the dream and give him that interpretation of it. It's interesting. This is a great point. That the king asks Daniel to interpret the dream, to give him the dream and the interpretation. And he says, I hear you can interpret dreams. You can tell me the dream. And Daniel says, that's not for magicians, astrologers, soothsayers, or wise men. He said, I'm no exception. Neither I nor anyone else can do that. But God can. And God will give you the answer to your questions. And then after it's over and the king Nebuchadnezzar is lavishing gifts and praise upon Daniel, it said that the great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy, because it didn't come from Daniel. It came from God himself. And in the Septuagint, it usually adds a few details. Then it says, the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all his wise men. But before he did that, he lavished praise on Daniel's God. Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery. Now that reminds me of the experience of another interpreter of dreams. In the 41st chapter of Genesis, we find Joseph before a Pharaoh, and at the recommendation of the king's cupbearer, who remembered Joseph and said, I want someone that can interpret your dream, Pharaoh. Now, Joseph wasn't going to have to tell him the dream and then interpret it. But Pharaoh, with Joseph standing before him, says, I hear you can interpret dreams. And Joseph says, no, I can't. But God can. That's an important lesson. That's a very important lesson. You know, there's a great deal of preoccupation these days with what are called prophetic dreams. And while certainly we know from Scripture that dreams can be prophetic, But people want to tell you their dreams and supply you their interpretation of it. Oftentimes, what they think God is saying. I'm very suspicious of that activity, I have to be honest. Now, I think there are meaning in many dreams, meaning in my own dreams, and the meaning is mainly to me. I don't feel that they're prophetic for others. And I'm sort of hit and miss on interpreting my own dreams. I've been asked to help interpret dreams of other people, and really am very clueless on that. I mean, I know I've read what Sigmund Freud said about the interpretation of dreams, and I have read what many other people said about the interpretation of dreams, and I think that is the purview of God. If God gives you the interpretation to a dream, I'd go with that. If David Finch gives you an interpretation of your dream, not so much. But the important point is that there are many things besides the interpretation of dreams where the proper attitude is, I'm inadequate for that. However, the God I serve is not limited in any regard whatsoever. So I can't, but God can. And there are many things in life that we hear the voice of God and we feel compelled to act and do things that are not really in the center of our skill set. And if we recognize that, in fact, we are correct, we can't do such things. However, if God is telling us, then God can. And he can use our obedience. And we can find ourselves doing things and accomplishing things that we really didn't have the power to do or accomplish. So I wanted that lesson from the second chapter not to be missed. So I want to reach back and cover that. Now we're going to study another story. And all of these are great Bible school stories. And in the Septuagint, there are a couple more added on to the end of Daniel, which we're going to cover. The story of Susanna, as well as the story of Bel and the snake. So, and they're great Bible stories for Sunday school. And here's one that I heard so very often as a child, and actually had the benefit of this high-tech learning method called flannel graph. Anybody remember flannel graph? Where they had cut out plastic pictures with backing on them to have them adhere to flannel fabric that would cover the board, and they would place the figures on there and give the narrative to tell the Bible stories to us kids. Really high tech. Now we have the third chapter, and I'll use the NIV tonight, and the third chapter of Daniel, beginning with the first verse. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, about 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. That's a big image of gold. That's a lot of gold. And he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. All the muckety-mucks were going to be there. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "Nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. Wear a mask and socially distance." Oh, no, that's not what he said. I kind of read that wrong. I don't know how that jumped out. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. And if you dare to wear a mask and actually attend church service, you will be hit with a stiff fine from the county judge. Oh, I'm sorry, that's not in there either. I'm sorry, I don't know where I'm getting this. Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshiped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, with their masks on, no doubt. My wife is waving and flailing her arms wildly over here, trying to get me to cut that out. I'm hearing you, darling. I really am. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "May the king live forever. Your Majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold. And that whosoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your Majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up." Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you're ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Well, that was a pretty presumptive diatribe there, wasn't it? He'd already seen that the God of Daniel and Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego was capable of telling him the secret about the dream he had dreamed. Apparently that didn't impress him suitably. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your Majesty's hand. Our God is stronger than you, King. This is the God that can save us from your hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your Majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Being insistent and speaking truth to power has its hazards. And never underestimate the arrogance of a ruler or a county judge in Tarrant and Dallas counties. Just saying. trouble. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed from one of tolerance to one of fury and retribution. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Now, the Septuagint does provide some additional details here. It tells how many hundred feet in the air the flames and the smoke of the furnace went because of the intensity of the heat, as well as that it was fueled, the extra heat was fueled by naphtha and tar. And tar burns very hot, and naphtha is essentially lighter fluid. So it was being fueled by the usual means, by the wood, but made hotter by adding asphalt or pitch and naphtha. So you can imagine how volatile and erratic that flame would have been, and the type of black smoke that was billowing from it, and the flames rising far into the air. This was a dramatic scene. I think the scripture is even a little subdued in explaining just how dramatic all this was and how Nebuchadnezzar made every effort to make that fire unquenchable. It couldn't be put out with water at this point. Make it unquenchable and as hot as possible to minimize the chances of any god in his esteem being able to intervene on behalf of these 3. But we know the rest of the story. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement. All this dramatic, this black smoke and these flames hundreds of feet in the air, and men dying because the flames had been rendered so hot with such volatile combustibles. So King Nebuchadnezzar leaps to his feet in amazement and asks his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, Your Majesty." He said, "Look, I see 4 walking around in the fire, not being consumed, not screaming in agony, not writhing and shriveling in the flames or being reduced to powder very quickly, but walking around, unbound and unharmed. And the 4th looks like a son of the gods. A B'nai Ha-Elohim." Now, I'm not sure how Nebuchadnezzar would know what the appearance of a son of the gods looked like, but certainly it was something impressive about this 4th individual that had the semblance of a man, but was clearly distinguishable as being supernatural. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." Oh, he was certainly impressed by the performance of their God. And the challenge that he had thrown down is now the reality of his mistake is becoming apparent. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, And the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was there a hair of their head singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. They were in the middle of a fire fueled by tar and naphtha, and there was no smell of fire on them. And it was billowing tons of black smoke and flames high into the air, and they were completely untouched. It doesn't add here that they asked for sweaters because there's a little chill in there. That's not even in the Septuagint. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants." Now here's another reference to that figure in the Old Testament, the angel of the Lord. And oftentimes it is a Christophany. It is an appearance of Christ in the Old Testament, such as his meeting with Abraham under the oaks of Mamre and other occasions. And here's another one of those occasions, perhaps, where this was not a son of the gods. This was the Son of God. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own. Doesn't really need a lot of explanation, does it? Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. So then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. This story is not mysterious. It's a very straightforward story. What is mysterious is that not very many people in this day and time behave as if they really believe what we just read. They're afraid of all sorts of things. They're afraid of kings. Where's our list? They're afraid of kings, satraps, prefects, governors, judges, treasurers, advisors, magistrates, and all other types of provincial officials. I think an orderly society should pay due attention to all these offices. However, when it is a choice between listening to these voices and doing what we know to do, whether it is being told we can't meet and worship, or that our civil liberties are now subordinate to the petty rules of some self-important ruler. I know. Be subject to the rulers, and there's no ruler that is not appointed by God. We'll find out that Nebuchadnezzar is appointed by God. Pharaoh, that Joseph stood in front of, was appointed by God, but they were judged for their unbelief and for their efforts against the people of God. Stand up. Be strong. Don't be intimidated by any earthly ruler when considering obedience to the supreme ruler of the universe. Take care, Farmers Branch.